Day 9, April 9th, 1865. Victory. Washington, D.C. and Appomattox, Virginia. As the steamboat River Queen chugs towards the Washington Navy Yard, its distinguished passengers stand at the deck rail and watch the Capitol come into view. The city is glowing with the light of hundreds of bonfires. Cheering and shouting and singing is heard from the streets. On the boat, Lincoln, his face lit by the warm orange light, is smiling. For 2 weeks he has been away from the minute-to-minute worries of the White House, on a trip to the war front in Virginia. Although he has seen the deadly results of some of the battles there, he's also witnessed the advance of the Union Army and knows victory is close. His aides have noticed that his mood, often so grim during the last 4 years, has relaxed. His indescribable sadness, said one friend, has been replaced by an expression of serene joy. The citizens of Washington are celebrating the capture of the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, just 6 days earlier. After hearing the news of the victory, Lincoln rushed to Richmond and walked directly to the mansion that Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, had recently fled. Entering Davis's former office, Lincoln sank down in the chair, according to one of the aides. The war was not yet completely over, but it was as if the chess game had been won. The king captured the king. Before returning to the White House, Lincoln stops to visit Secretary of State Seward, who had been badly injured in a carriage accident a few years before. "I think we are near the end at last," he reassures his friend. But Seward's injury has left Lincoln worried. Back at the White House, his old sadness seems to have returned. Then, as he's catching up on a few things before heading to bed, he's interrupted by his Secretary of War. Edwin Stanton is carrying a telegram just received from the head of the Union Army, General Ulysses S. Grant. General Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia this afternoon on terms proposed by myself. Although Lee's men account for only about 1/6 of the total Confederate forces, Lee's stature and the strategic importance of his army means the war should be over in days rather than months. It's simply a question of how long the remaining rebels resist the inevitable. End of the line. More telegrams arrive in details of Lee's surrender. After the fall of Richmond, Grant guessed correctly that Lee would head toward the railway at Appomattox Station. The Union Army got there first, cutting off the rebel supply and any chance of escape. Lee, who had already refused one request by Grant to surrender, now ignored another. But Lee's aides finally convinced their commander that it was useless to fight further. The usual formal notes were exchanged, and a meeting of the two generals was set for the Appomattox courthouse. Lee arrived in full splendor, a new uniform, clean boots, and a glittering sword. Grant, as usual, wore a simple old shirt, unbuttoned to reveal his undershirt, and worn but muddy boots. Although he hadn't changed into ceremonial dress, Grant showed deep respect for his rival, who in fact had been the most admired soldier in the U.S. Army before choosing to fight for the Confederacy. He also offered Lee generous surrender terms. Lee's men merely give up their army weapons and give their word that they would not fight again. They could immediately return home with whatever possessions they owned. These terms were in keeping with the desires of Lincoln. He had told Grant he wanted to let the rebel soldiers get back to work on their farms and in their stores. Under the photo on page 119, Lee and Grant surrounded by aides at the surrender talks. After the surrender papers were signed, Grant and Lee shook hands and Lee excused himself. While he waited on the porch of the courthouse for his horse, his frustration finally broke through his stiff formality. Union officers saw the famous Confederate general punch the palm of his left hand with his right fist 3 times. All's fair in love and war. 18 months earlier, few people would have guessed that Lee would consider surrender, and fewer still would have guessed it would be to Grant. Lee and his army had escaped at Gettysburg. The Union Army seemed to miss every chance it had to defeat the Confederates. When the Union General Meade failed to finish Lee at Gettysburg, Lincoln gave greater responsibility to Grant, who had been winning important battles in the West. Lincoln admired Grant's fighting spirit. In March 1864, Grant was put in command of the entire Union Army. He immediately devised a strategy to attack the Confederate forces in several places at once, and to destroy whatever civilian property and businesses were being used to support the Confederacy. This was a change from the military etiquette of the time, which called for armies only to fight other armies. Grant didn't care. He wanted the war to end and wasn't worried about being called impolite. His determination, however, caused his reputation to suffer. Under his command, the armies fought more, and that meant more casualties. He was unfairly accused of not caring about deaths. He also refused prisoner exchanges with the South because he knew he could replace a Union soldier being held by the Confederacy more easily than the Confederacy could replace one of the soldiers he was holding. Families of imprisoned Union soldiers hated Grant for this policy, but Lincoln supported him. The two men usually thought alike, and the respect that each other had for the other was a relief to Lincoln after so many disappointing generals during the first 2 years of the war. Under the photo on page 122, Ulysses S. Grant, 1822 to 1885, graduated from West Point and served with distinction in the Mexican-American War, but failed to advance as an officer and left the Army. He joined when the Civil War began. As a result of his great military successes, he was elected president in 1868. Unfortunately, his experience in the field hadn't prepared him for the politics. Honest himself and overly trusting of others, his administration became a favorite of corrupt politicians and their associates. The war at home. Lincoln had his own battles. To pay for the war, he needed money from Congress, and to get the approval of congressmen, he had to offer favors in return, such as political and military jobs. His cabinet members continued to battle with one another, sometimes because of the real philosophical differences, other times merely because their personalities clashed. At the election of 1864 approached, one member of the cabinet, Secretary of Treasury Chase, tried to take the Republican Party nomination from Lincoln. While that effort came to nothing, Lincoln's Democratic opponent was almost surprising. General George McClellan, formerly commander of the Union Army, whose enormous vanity and utter lack of fighting ability had frustrated Lincoln at the beginning of the war and allowed the rebels a long string of victories. McClellan promised to negotiate peace with the Confederacy to end the war. A lot of Americans liked the idea of peace settlement. Many Northern laborers were fearful that a flood of freed slaves would take their jobs. Some hated the idea of risking their lives for people they imagined to be an economic threat. Under the photo on page 124, the cover page of a campaign song from the 1864 election. There had been riots when Lincoln ordered young men into military service. Some Americans were simply exhausted by the war. The casualties were far beyond what anyone had imagined they'd be when the war began. In the early days of 1864, before Grant took full command of the Army, there were few victories to strengthen voters' confidence. But under Grant and the generals like William T. Sherman, the Union Army moved steadily forward as Election Day approached. Important victories, like the capture of Atlanta, Georgia, changed the public's mood. In the election, Lincoln won a majority of votes, and in the Electoral College beat McClellan 212 votes to 21 votes. Andrew Johnson from the rival Democratic Party ran as Lincoln's vice president. The old rival parties joined for this one election in what was called the National Union Party. Lincoln had already dedicated his second term as president to the cause of the Reconstruction, the rebuilding of the nation after the war's inevitable end. Many in his party want the South to be punished. Lincoln, as he said publicly, and as he had more recently instructed Grant, feels differently. In his second inaugural address, he asked that the country proceed with malice toward none and charity for all, to achieve a just and a lasting peace. They're playing our song. From a window in the White House, Lincoln looks out at the street celebrations. He knows the partying will last all week. This morning's surrender by Lee comes just a few days before the 4th anniversary of South Carolina's bombardment of Fort Sumter, which started the war. Fort Sumter is also back in Union hands, and official celebrations have already been planned to mark the anniversary. Although he had hoped to watch unnoticed, someone on the street spots him in the window, and soon a crowd is outside the White House serenading him. The crowd is shouting for him to make a speech. I suppose arrangements are being made for some sort of formal demonstration, this or perhaps tomorrow night, he says. I shall have nothing to say if you dribble it all out before me. We can't wait, the crowd calls back. Well, Lincoln says, I see you have a band with you. We have 2 or 3. Well then, I've always thought Dixie one of the best tunes I've ever heard. Our adversaries over the way attempted to appropriate it, but I insisted yesterday that we fairly captured it. The crowd interrupts him with a cheer. I presented the question to the Attorney General, Lincoln continues, and he gave it his legal opinion that it is our lawful prize. I now request the band to favor me with its performance.